you all the recordings as well. So everybody has them. Okay. Welcome back for day 2 of the Graduate Student Symposium hosted by Howard University and the University of Ghana's Institute of African Studies, as well as Howard University's Graduate Student Council, in partnership with the Ghana Tourism Authority, the Beyond the Return Initiative, and the Ghana Embassy in Washington, D.C. I want to acknowledge my colleagues over at the University of Ghana, Dr. Mjiba Frehwatz and Dr. Hasiatu Abubakari. I want to actually turn it over to you all to say a few words and of welcome and perhaps some announcements about some other upcoming conferences.
Good morning to those of us on this side, good afternoon to those of you on that side, and good evening to those of us who may be in South Africa. So thank you again for having us and being at this exciting 2-day graduate symposium. I also want to thank my colleagues at Howard University, Dr. Msia Clark, as well as all of the students from Howard and the Institute of African Studies who have presented yesterday and will present today. I'm sure you'll agree that yesterday was a very exciting, enlightening, and forward-looking series of presentations from future academics. So I would like to just welcome you back to this exciting presentation. And I also want to make a very brief announcement. I also am the treasurer of the African Studies Association of Africa. And this is a association that's 10 years old and basically takes, the study, engagement, thinking, and future planning of African studies right back to the continent. And so we are having our 10th year anniversary and our 5th biannual conference in Lubumbashi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, in October of 2023. So we're welcoming everyone to join us at this conference. The interesting thing about this conference is the theme will be around reparations. It'll be around repatriating knowledge and materials back to the African continent and global Africa. So we'll welcome you there. I will put the link to ASAA in the chat because we also welcome members, student members, faculty members from global Africa. That's Africans at home and abroad. Thank you so much and welcome again. Back to you, Dr. Clark.
Thank you. So I will turn it over to today's moderator. Today's moderator is a second-year PhD student in the Department of African Studies at Howard University, Linda Madeline Selim Muden. I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Thank you, Dr. Mjia Frehibot. So good morning, good afternoon, bonjour, bon après-midi. So welcome back to the second day, and I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation today as yesterday. So we are going to start with Aseye Temakroe, who is a filmmaker and also a PhD candidate at the University of African Studies at the University of Ghana, Legon. And she's going to present on Order and Chaos, Reading Urbanism in Ghanaian Cinema. So Aseye, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So I'll be sharing my screen. All right, so my PhD thesis actually is Order and Chaos, Reading Urbanism in African Cinema, and it's a study under the project Entanglements, Mobility and Improvisation of Culture and Arts in Contemporary African Urbanism and its Hinterland. But today, as part of my work, I'm also looking at Hausa video films, and because it forms part of Ghanaian cinema. And here I will use cinema as industry, as art form, and sometimes as space, and I'll let you know. This is work in progress, and presenting this part is also work in progress, because thinking of the symposium and the main goal of talking about diaspora, I tried to sort of skew this to kind of fitting, because whilst thinking about how to put this presentation together, it also occurred to me that when I go back to my work, I might want to look at relationships between, revisiting the diaspora in discussing African urbanism. So here we go. So just a second. So in the debate for African urbanism, it's that African cities normally are framed in otherness, and you find that in early literature and even still, that Sub-Saharan Africa really is supposed to be a place that lacks history by certain writers. And so if you've been around the African urbanism space in discourses and in conversation, it's always as if something new is happening. You know, the urban space in Africa is new and it's now emerging, and it looks problematic. But that's not the case, because before colonialism, many centuries ago, cities existed on the continents where trade, religious activities, and many other things were happening. And because there's the myth that African societies were invented, you know, as a version of their rural other, that's how come this kinds of productions of knowledge have been put there. And the work we're doing now is to try to debunk and also prove that the cities have always been there. Of course, there are new things happening, but at the same time too, there's a very interesting relationship between African cities and their hinterlands, whether the relationships are precarious, porous, blurred, whatever, but there's constant interaction. And so you find that there's studying urbanity in Ghana especially, you find that there's a lot more literature in the disciplines of geography, sociology, anthropology, but when it comes to film, there's almost nothing. Also, even reading African urbanism in global Africa, people are now presenting the nuances in the discourse of cityness. And there's also an attempt to recalibrate the discourse on African urbanism. And also that scholars are now looking at African cities and hinterlands have critical sites for cultural and artistic production, which didn't used to be. So this study will use film as a social and cultural product in trying to push the discourse of present other narratives about African urbanism. And why? Because one, I want to interrogate the omission of or silence of Hausa films in urban discourse. Also that the video films came as a counter to Western hegemony in cinema, and also to put across that cinema can be a fundamental, or filmmaking can be a fundamental part of urban discourse, but also try to use Hausa video film production as a way of revisiting the conversation about diaspora. And as I go on, we'll see why. So film is in film narrative, the images produce ideas, ways of thinking, doing, feeling. It has been proved many times that film has a way of disturbing the equilibrium and also disturbing the status quo because of sometimes how stories are presented to us. And also that film sometimes also shifts creates shifts in social context. So what you think you know sometimes can be retold, reinterrogated, and represented to you through films. And this is also because in urban studies, you know, the cinema's ability to capture image and sound have contributed a lot to what we see as the urban. So sometimes, even though the conversation when it comes to urban studies goes to development, city planning, etc., some of the other parts is that what we hear and see also have a way of reconscientizing and forming knowledge. And even because film itself is a point of knowledge production, you can get to understand the urban space a lot also by film. Now, the studies contextualized within the broader urban discourses where space, place, and representation will be considered and how these are also performed. The approach to the study is reading and rereading, and reading and rereading because the films become primary text that is used for the analysis and also for critical reading of what the urban is for you, the scholar, and also for the filmmakers themselves. So because the other thing is that in my interaction with some of these filmmakers, you realize that the things we are even coming up with as scholars did not even occur to them when they were making some of these films, you know, so you want to look at all of this. Now, a brief history about Ghanaian cinema. So the very first feature film that came from the Gold Coast Film Unit in 1952, directed by a man called Sean Graham, had an all Ghanaian cast, but a British crew largely, and it was titled The Boy Kumasenu. And this film was made intentionally to actually present the anxieties of the colonial government at the time of rapid urbanization, and also to poke policymakers at the time in the British Gold Coast. Now, after that, there was independence, and through that, there were the coups. But by the time independence was happening, the filmmaking space in Ghana was state-owned, because, I mean, sort of from the British to the Ghanaians. But our first president invested a lot in creating a state-of-the-art space for filmmaking. And then he was overthrown in 1966. But between the era of 1966 to the 1980s, film production sort of happened. I mean, sparingly, some of these films were made by the Ghana film industry, which was state-owned, but also had individuals working for them. And so these are some of the films. Tombo Hamlet was an adaptation of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, No Tears for Anansi, and then I Told You So. Now, there've been, just even by what I just said earlier, there's been different paradigm shifts in Ghanaian cinema as the years went by. And the 1980s witnessed independent and state collaboration, but over time it has become more independent. So a film like Love Road, Kukrantumi, and others were early independent filmmaking that started from the 80s. And as time went on, the paradigm shifted again, where by the late 1980s, film production in the format of celluloid had moved to that of video production. And video came with its own issues. But video also had to be birthed also as a necessity, because the structural adjustment programs had started, and there really wasn't money to invest in film production, because you make the films, you take it outside to go and print, bring them back, etc. But the video were more like easy to make. But the gatekeepers of the art form, both in the continent, beyond, and even here, were resisting video filmmaking. They felt that it was too easy. It was the films that were made were imitations of Hollywood, and it was also cheap entertainment. But at the time, it was convenient as well. And so some of the categories of films that came through the birth of video was that we had English, we have Akan or Chi, and we have Hausa filmmaking. Now, the English films have always existed because of the legacy of colonialism. But over time, adding the local languages also was part of the paradigm shift. And the early video films, some of them are this film. So Zinabu in 1987 is said to be the first video feature film made from Ghana by William Akufo. And then there were others, and then there's Diabolo, and by the posters. So I'm going to do some small shifts through the posters, and you see, even by the posters, the change in time. So
I say 1 minute, please.
Okay, so by that time, I have 1 minute more.
Minute left.
All right, so I'm going to jump then. So in Hausa filmmaking, Nima, a place in Accra, is said to be the hub of filmmaking and Hausa filmmaking, because this place is a place where many people converge, Ghanaians, non-Ghanaians, but it's like a melting pot for West African migrants, and the language of operation, commerce, everything is Hausa. And even though Hausa has not been formalized as a language in Ghana, Hausa filmmaking has come to gain some popularity and also space. And in this filmmaking, there's you have filmmakers dealing with issues of home, place settlement, etc. So these are some of the films that I looked at. And the Hausa films also have, in a way, for me, also revisited the conversation about the diaspora. So because in my findings, after a critical reading of the films, I find that all these films present issues of place, space, the different type of city dwellers, movement and mobility, and performing aspiration. And I find that some of these things are also present in the conversation about diaspora. And so in recognizing struggles, in recognizing the same audiences, and also creating community and inclusivity. And because the Zongo is also tied to commerce, transient life, cultural hybridity, and liminality, I thought that I'd want to look at it with the diaspora conversation. And so in a nutshell, it is supposed to show that cinema in many ways influences the way we construct images of the world and how we operate within it. If questions come, I'll go back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aseye. Can you stop sharing, please? Thank you. And you can write the question in the chat and also in the Q&A if for those who have some question. And we are going to go to our next person, which is Jessica Whitaker, who is a PhD student here at Howard. And she's going to present on energy, poverty, and insecurity in Africa and the US, and the impact of targeted power grid cyber attacks. So Jessica, you can start.
Hello,
10 minutes, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello, we can hear you, Jessica.
All right. Okay. All right. Today, as mentioned, I'll be talking about targeted power grid cyber attacks on energy poverty and insecurity in Africa and the US. I'd like to begin by tying in the internet and how it relates to the supply of electricity. And so in this diagram, you see all the many applications of the internet. So you may have heard of the Internet of Things, Internet of People, and Internet of Services. And where we're focusing today is over here in the Internet of Things, where you see the smart grid and the smart home. So I'll expand on that. All right, and so here on the left in the diagram, you have a picture of the smart grid. And this is literally the grid that supplies electricity into homes, into buildings. And so what you have here in this diagram is all various types of generation. And so you have your solar panels, your wind farms, your traditional power plants that are either powered by fuel, different types of oil, or other sources. And you also have electric cars. And so basically anything that is tied to the internet in order to allow electricity to come into the various, either the buildings or the homes, then once we go over the internet, then we consider that smart, because basically we're controlling the supply of electricity. And then on the right-hand side, you see the image of the smart home. And so again, as this is evolving, you see all the many ways that we could potentially be tying to the internet within our home. And when we're tying to the internet for things like the alarm system, for the smart TV, for the solar panels, anything that is, again, going across that Internet of Things is then considered smart. And that is the way in which we're passing electricity, or communicating, I guess, about electricity across the internet. And so where this presents a problem as it relates to cybersecurity and cyber attacks is that whenever you pass anything over the internet, then at that point, it is vulnerable to cyber attacks. So specifically within the smart grid, sometimes it's also referred to as a cyber physical energy system. And basically all that means is that, as you see on the right-hand side in the diagram, the bottom layer in the blue is considered the physical component, so your actual power lines, and then the top part where we're doing all of the communication back and forth between all of the power lines and the different power plants, and with your homes or with the buildings, that's what we consider cyber, or the cyberspace. And so in the diagram on the left-hand side, think about all the many things that we're doing. That's transportation, as now you have smart vehicles, you're talking about healthcare, you have the financial market, of course, as I mentioned, electric cars, and all of the many ways that we're supplying electricity. And so here at the top of, throughout this diagram, you see the little figures that represent all the many types of cyber attacks that are happening at any point within this supply of electricity. And so here, specifically looking at electricity within Ghana, this kind of gives you an idea of the total generation capacity, which basically just means the total amount of electricity that's being supplied within Ghana. And so there's a mix here when you look at hydro, which simply means provided by water, and different types of gas. You have the solar, which is provided by the sun, bio, which is also called biomass. So that could be things like wood chips, different types of agriculture that's used, diesel, oil, and then HFO just stands for heavy fuel oil. So all of those are just different types of oil. And it's important to note here for the connections that the access rate for electricity in these figures provided by Power Africa is 84% across the country. And then within the urban areas, it's higher with 93%. And then in the rural, it's 73%. So if you look at the diagrams here on the right, you see that this in the top diagram, this is West Africa's first solar hybrid. And here, what this simply means is you have the solar panels, and it's mixed with, notice it's on top of water. So you're actually getting the electricity supply from both the solar panels and the water. And keep in mind that with the sun supplying the electricity to the solar panels, when the sun is not shining, then that means the panels are not supplying electricity. So that's when the hydro or the water comes into play. And then at the bottom, this shows an actual transmission tower with the transmission lines. And notice it says that this is a digitization project. And whenever you hear the word digitization as it relates to electricity, that means that we are going across the internet, which means it's opening it up for cyber attacks. And so here, this particular one, something that is often overlooked within the US is that we have a major problem with energy insecurity and energy poverty. And so as you see here, this particular partial form of the table really shows regionally how extreme it is. And so in the South, where there is a higher Black population within the US, you see that that is by far that higher number of and this is represented in millions. And so if you look across at some of the things that are causing this insecurity, you have that people are foregoing food and medicine to pay for energy. They're experiencing different extremes for temperature, which is also life-threatening. And so here, this kind of shows some charts that I thought were pretty good in US households. Just gives you a quick breakdown of within the US, about 30% or a little over 30%. So you're thinking 1 in 3 households are battling this or challenged by energy insecurity. And then on the right-hand side there, it's completely tied to both income and also focus. The higher numbers are definitely within the Black population. And so some of the impacts, they cross over things from ranging from the neighborhood, housing, economic, physical, environmental, health interactions. And so what this diagram here shows is what exactly that means. And so it ranges from everything from within the neighborhoods, the whole socioeconomic impact when you do not have electricity supply. Keep in mind that means that you cannot get to the internet, you cannot charge your phone. There's, you can, if you have any type of, you're using electricity for heating, for cooking, it's just massive as far as the impact of electricity or the lack thereof on your existence. And so to that point, from a social standpoint, when you think about just that limited cohesion and just trying to get the collective advocacy for the housing, which may not be energy efficient. You also may have large expenditures because of this inefficiency within the buildings. And then from the physical living conditions, again, keep in mind that this may be extreme temperatures depending on the whether you have extreme cold or extreme heat. And so again, the lack of electricity can lead to death. And we do have, of course, documented research that shows we've had death due to energy poverty and energy insecurity. You also have environmental and health factors like mold and moisture, and then just with the interaction as far as the stigma associated with anything related to poverty, especially with energy. And so as we look here with some of the, just thinking about the factors, so you look at access, affordability, flexibility, energy efficiency needs and practices. And so there's no access to affordable energy, there's inability to pay for the cost. So you have poor air quality, poor living conditions, and which leads to health issues, and then the rationing of support services or the lack of support services completely. So when we look at the consequences, overall, we have significant portions of the population within the US and around the world, within Africa, where people are considered energy insecure and energy poor. And there's a difference that we often underlook between inconvenience versus life-altering circumstances. And so, and even though the infrastructure may exist, then it's still can be limited supply because you have to connect the homes or the buildings with the actual infrastructure. So this is where, when you think of cyber attacks, sometimes these cyber attacks are focused on these disadvantaged populations. And they may be either for economic reasons, racial, ethnic motivation, or because of rural areas. So in conclusion, with the security challenges that we face in supplying energy, electricity, power, they all mean the same thing. We use those terms interchangeably, but again, whenever we're supplying electricity across the internet, that's when we open ourselves up for cyber attacks. And in particular with cyber attacks, when we look at the complexities of those facing energy insecurity and energy poverty, if there's an attack that's being used in with targeted intent, meaning either for those economically challenged, racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination, or rural, remote or smaller populations, then we can, within this space of cyber attack detection, we can think of the intent of these targeted attacks and use it to factor into our machine learning detection mechanisms. Okay. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for that great presentation.
And I will stop sharing now.
Yes, please. And I still invite people to put their question and comment in the chat and the Q&A. So our next panelist is Eric Nate Kumadoe, who is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of African Studies in Ghana, Legon, and who is going to present on protest and resistance to forced labor recruitment in Ghanaian Min, 1874-1930. Thank you, Eric. You have 10 minutes. Eric, can you hear us? Hello? Your mic is off.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. So the title of my presentation is Protest and Resistance to Forced Labor Recruitment. I just have some visuals that I'll be sharing as I go, but the presentation itself would be, you have to listen to me because I don't have the points in the screen that you're seeing. All right, so colonialism was imposed in Africa on the belief of European civilization. Now, civilization meant many things to many sectors of life. I'm sure we are aware with what it means in the religious sphere, abandoning our demonic and fetish ways of worshiping for the godly, holy, and cleaner practices of European Christianity. In itself, those who subjected themselves to these practices had to be further civilized through renaming, which is a process of adopting white names on black bodies. It also had its meanings in the practice of healing, in the kind of clothes that are worn, the food eating, and how we go about all of that. In the area of labor, however, civilization meant the abolishment of domestic enslavement. And there are a few accounts that spoke highly of how the civilizing mission was going to put an end to this background, to this backward form of labor. In its wake, the colonizers sought to create free labor without coercion. In the Gold Coast, the most important step towards this goal was the proclamation of 1874. This proclamation was effected at the infant stage of colonialism, when fancy dreams extolling British virtues were shared. These dreams were yet to be put to the real test of administering the colony with meager resources, yet many needs. It soon became apparent that the colonial establishment and its accompanying business interests were going to grapple with the labor question. Hence, in no time, these colonial officers who were charged with the responsibility of enforcing anti-enslavement laws among Ghanaian people found themselves in a paradox when they needed labor for public works, especially in road and railway construction. Within this same period, European interest in gold mining had emerged and secured promising concessions backed by huge capital, yet lacking in labor supply. Now, an analysis of the chronological progress, which entailed abolishment and its enforcement from 1874, and the subsequent acceptance of forced labor for public works and later for mining, observes a shift from anti-enslavement enforcers to advocacy for enslavement by a new name. This reading suggests a volte-face in official British policy on labor within their occupied territories. However, a closer reading of the global reality of labor within European colonies in Asia, the Americas, and other parts of Africa offers a contrary viewpoint from the suggestion of a volte-face. Forms of bonded labor with conditions almost the same as slavery became a consistent labor policy successor after abolition. This was very much the case in the United States of America, especially in the era following Reconstruction, that was characterized by numerous re-enslavement schemes. It was also the case in India. Along the way, the British re-enslavement schemes connected India with the South African mines through indentured labor, as well as the Caribbean islands. What stands out from both perspectives, the chronological and the wider global reality, is what Eric Alina has coined as colonial innovations in servitude. This study analyzes the phenomenon of coerced labor in Ghana and how it played out in the mines with a focus on laborers during the period 1874 to 1930. Like Africans in most of the colonies and oppressed groups around the world, these laborers acted in ways that this study perceives as forms of resistance. The study examines these acts of resistance with the objective of understanding their specific motivations and how they are linked with a broader body of work that examines these multiple re-enslavement schemes carried out by European colonizers. Resistance to forced labor in the mines has been mentioned multiple times, yet not closely examined. These desertions have been treated as if they are expected and predictable outcomes that require no explanation. While they have been noted, attempts to understand the mind of these laborers, their intentions and what they sought to communicate have been lacking. Beyond these, what factors made it possible to resist and what made it impossible to do so? What purposes did these acts of resistance serve to the laborers and to the system of coerced labor broadly? Now, how did forced labor play out in Ghana? It first began as an intervention into public work, such as the construction of roads and railways. Communities were required to provide persons to work. This was done in cooperation with the indigenous rulers. It has been argued that inducements were crucial in the implementation of these labor policies. For a definitive date, one account places this phenomenon at the immediate aftermath of the fall of Asante in 1901. Another account has noted its existence in the dying decades of the 19th century. Now, the reasons for these imprecise accounts trying to evade accountability, since this era coincided with movements against slavery and all forms of unfree labor. While French and English colonizers were very intentional in their methods to hide these policies in official correspondences, their Portuguese colleagues were very open and explicit in justifying the practice. The accounts of Frederick Lugard and Antonio Ennis illustrate this attitude on the British. I'm currently in the process of establishing what processes and decisions and what actors were involved in shifting the coerced labor policy from a public work-centered activity to a private interest-led intervention. There is evidence of pressure from mine managers on the colonial government in Accra and in London. There is also evidence of unwillingness on the part of the colonizers. So who caved in and under what factors did they have to? Presently, I'm in the process of cataloging the types of oppression that the laborers who made it to the mines were subjected to. A few examples are what can be termed today as creative accounting, which are methods used to rob them of their income by intermediaries and the mining companies themselves. Physical abuse, such as flogging, lack of rest, poor food, shelter, and neglect of their health. I'm also cataloging their initiatives and resistance to these treatments. The key activity here is desertion, which was done at various levels. Some occurred immediately after these laborers were out of the jurisdiction of their kings, while still in their regions. Others left when they were far away from their regions, like in locations as Kumasi. If you look at the map on the screen, you can tell where the northern territories and where the Asante Confederation is, where you see Kumasi. Others went all the way to the mines and deserted upon arrival, while others signed the bonds or contracts which require them to serve for 6 months and sometimes 12 months, and they deserted before the expected time. Others used the state and management structures to register their protests. In conclusion, I have demonstrated a guiding yet incongruous belief in European thoughts at the time that enslavement of Africans by Africans was uncivilized, yet enslavement by Europeans was a way of civilizing Africans. And finally, forced labor was slavery by another name or any other name, and it constituted a denial or loss of personal sovereignty, which in turn opens the enslaved for violation, which also engenders resistance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eric, for this great presentation. You can stop sharing, but you still had 2 minutes though. We didn't saw the 2 other slides.
Okay, so then I could share a few of the visuals that I have over here. Here is an illustration of a gang of crew workers in the 1890s. Now, the crew workers came from southwestern Liberia, and they were the first group of laborers during Ghana's first gold boom from the late 1870s to 1880s. But at some point, after Liberia was established, they sought to keep their laborers within their borders so that they don't lose them to other colonies within Africa. And then the final one here is a picture of white man managers and some black workers. And this is sourced from the National Archives of the UK, and it's called from the work of Cassandra McPherson, Contract Men, Colonial Capital. Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you can stop sharing the screen, please.
Yes, I'm doing that now.
Okay. So our next panelist is Ebenezer Kwesi Busompra, who is also a PhD candidate at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. And he's going to present on constructionist perspective of the conceptualization of children in conflict with the law in Ghana. So you have 10 minutes, Ebenezer.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, so thank you very much. I'm presenting on the topic, the social construction of children as offenders. And I'm looking at this study specifically from the Gamashin area within Accra. Accra is the capital town, or the capital region, or the capital city of Ghana. And I'm looking at this particular group of people, a particular group. I will take my time to explain the geography. So basically, my topic seeks to interrogate how children seen as offenders are constructed within a given society. And I'm also interested in what factors and processes are accounting for these constructs. Because I believe that how offending children will be treated or managed is highly dependent on how a given society has constructed children, as offenders. I am starting by making the case that childhood is best understood within a cultural and a social context. And these contexts could be historical and, cultural in frame of reference. Children are seen as functional human and social beings. These constructions are not universal. The making of these constructions are usually specific to certain cultures or some cultures and traditions. Children in times past have been considered as a source of wealth world over, and particularly in Africa towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Population growth was rapid and children were considered a part of a man's wealth. They were an economic incentive to the family. However, the Western notions of childhood, which perceived children as innocent beings in need of protection from, labor and rapid transition into adulthood, attempts to prove that bad, in quotes, and vulnerable, also in quotes, children are a result of the failings of society and the cultural structures, particularly of Africa. This assertion is also due to the fact that Western notions of childhood are imported all across Africa. These imports were made possible more specifically by colonial administrators, educators, welfare officers, and most importantly, missionaries who traveled across Africa carrying particular ideas and ideals from the English. So African childhood is considered a social position or a stage rather than just a biological age, right? So these importations have challenged Africa's own cultural constructions of childhood, and this has caused some form of dissonance and conflicts. And the emergence as well of colonialism and urbanization also had a way of revolutionizing how childhood is constructed. Colonialism, which was a very significant influence in Africa's departure from the traditional cultural ideals for foreign social structural ideals and systems as well. With urbanization, right, came also a major movement of youth from rural areas to the city centers or urban centers. These movements were as a result of seeking better education, or what you call the Western formalized or formal education. It could also be that they are moving because parents had to go and work in some distance which is far away from the home, and so they needed to move to an older parent to take care of them. So these are some of the reasons that led to urbanization, or the movement of youth from rural areas to city centers. However, the urban and the city life was attractive to children and the youth, so it will obviously cause them to also move. And these youth and children, unable to sustain their life in the urban centers because it's also quite expensive to sustain that kind of life, obviously resorted to behaviors that can sustain their lifestyle. And these behaviors, were considered as crimes, under colonial law. Some of these behaviors include pickpocketing, prostitution. So it led to also, the effect of that behavior also led to a decline in the youth participation in formal education system. Now, focusing much more on Ghana and looking at it from the pre-colonial era, and I'm looking at it from before the 1800s when the English arrived on the soils of Gold Coast, or on the shores of Gold Coast. Ghana did not have a separate legal system for handling deviant children, right? So deviant and delinquent children were managed at home, at the home level, at the family level, at the community level, sometimes at traditional authority levels. So depending on the kind of challenges that these children are facing, either of these levels are made use of to make sure that the said child is brought back, to follow the set ideals of the community. Children were either corrected by their parents or they were sent to other members of the extended family, deemed a disciplinarian to correct these deviant children. When the delinquent behavior was considered to have escalated to a point of being beyond the family's ability to address, other revered or respected members of the community were consulted or involved in the correction of the delinquent child. Usually, the traditional authorities were the last resort for dealing with deviant children. All these levels of management do not take place without the involvement or the consent of parents and guardians. In Ghana, during colonialism, when colonialism was rife and the inception of urbanization, there was a creation of this formal administrative institutions, right? And even to post-independence, we've been following in these formal administrative institutions. They included legally mandated institutions to manage the emerging social problems within colonial Ghana as well. Colonial Ghana operated with the British common law tradition, and these laws were evident through various sections of the colonial Gold Coast economy. So crime in Ghana was managed with a drafted criminal code in the 1870s, which was also fashioned after the English criminal law. These laws mandated the creation and usage of prisons in Ghana. During this period, there were no formal provisions made for juvenile delinquents. No, juvenile delinquency was being managed through non-custodial means such as restitution, compensation, fines, mediation, apologies, punishments, many others. These systems of justice were managed by family heads and clan heads, chief and then council elders. So I am particularly or intentionally not defining terms such as deviance, juvenile delinquency, and others, because these are notions I would want to find out how it is constructed on the ground amongst my participants, amongst my respondents. And so I would not want to take the lead by trying to put forth a definition of what this stands for and what that stands for. When I do that, it brings some form of leveling. It brings some forms of, stratification and some form of standard for which their definitions should follow. So I'm situating the study within the social constructionist perspective, which views reality as socially constructed. In essence, what the perspective is saying is that reality is created and maintained through constant human interaction and communication. It holds this understanding of the world being shaped by social, cultural, and historical factors. And these factors influence the way individuals interpret and give meanings to events, experiences, and objects. The social construction suggests that knowledge, identity, reality are not fixed, but they are they are not fixed. They are also not objective, but rather they are constructed through the ongoing processes of communications, interactions, relationships of people within society. So the social constructionist, applying this to the work I'm doing, the social constructionist seeks to understand how the concepts of childhood, children, deviance, and delinquency, these are some concepts I've been able to come up with in reading, are defined, understood, and experienced in a given society. How are they being shaped by the society's beliefs, values, and norms? And these are the considerations so these considerations it considers factors such as what role the media will play, the laws of the nation or the given locality, the cultural beliefs, how are they all shaping the public perceptions of children and deviance. Most importantly also, there are ways in which children themselves are involved in constructing these concepts through their own experiences and interactions. So we are not just interested in what these other institutions are saying about them, but we're also interested in what they are saying about themselves. One other major tenet I want to talk about is the issue of power dynamics and how they shape their understanding of reality. According to this perspective, those in positions of power, so we are looking at the media, we are looking at parents, teachers, we are looking at religious leaders, we are looking at community and traditional leaders as well. They have a way of influence, or they hold some influence over how we understand and experience, childhood and the dominant narratives and discourses that, ensures within our society. And these are particularly what I seek to find out from my study. The objectives basically
Ebenezer, please, one more minute, please.
Yes, so the objectives I'm working with are the fact that I'm trying to examine the dominant constructions of childhood and children considered as offenders and how it impacts the treatment of such children. I'm also trying to investigate the ways in which cultural beliefs, value systems, media representation shape these public perceptions of children as offenders and how these perceptions impact policy intervention. I'm also trying to identify ways in which children and youth are involved in constructing and negotiating their own identities within the social context that defines them otherwise. In terms of methodology that I'm using a mixed method approach, particularly using, a survey, in-depth interview, focus group discussion. I'm focusing on Gamashi as my methodology. So Ghana has 16 administrative regions. I'm focusing on the Greater Accra, which also happens to be the regional capital of the country. And more specifically, I'm looking at the the Jamestown, Gamashi area. So I'm looking at the Gamashi area. So it includes places like Jamestown, the Bukom area. So Jamestown is also known for the Chalote Festival. All these are coastal areas with a major occupation as fishing, right? During the colonial era, all throughout, they've had constant interactions with the colonial masters. I am interested in finding out how this has affected the way they conceptualize or construct childhood and taking care of how they treat especially children that are found to be offenders. My population of interest within this area particularly includes parents, guardians, traditional community leaders, teachers, religious leaders, and children. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, please stop sharing. And we are going to jump to our last panelist, who is Deon Ozen, who is a PhD, third-year PhD student in clinical psychology here at Howard. And he's going to present on Afrofuturism, Pan-African identity through social connectedness. So Deon, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Just getting my screen ready. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. My name is Deon Ozen. I am a third-year clinical psychology PhD student here at Howard University. And this is going to be my presentation on Pan-African identity through social connectedness. So first I'll start off with kind of like an introduction of some of the terms like Pan-Africanism and social connectedness, and then I'll show how those connect to my research objectives. I'll go over a little bit of a literature review, and I am going to ask some questions to the audience just to kind of interact with you guys a little bit, so you guys can respond in the chat, and then I'll conclude with a little bit of discussion and conclusion. Okay. So just for starters, so this article on Pan-Africanism by Malisa in 2018, they defined Pan-Africanism in the following excerpt. So they said that although the word Pan-Africanism came into popular use in the 1950s, there are some who argue that the philosophy of Pan-Africanism was present and manifested itself not only in the protests and resistance to slavery, but the desire to return to Africa. And so the return to Africa was based on kind of like a vision of a triumphant or victorious Africa, right? What an Africa that's free of slavery and foreign domination. Unfortunately, the abolition of slavery didn't lead to a significant emancipation of Africans in the diaspora or in Africa itself, right? So the abolition of slavery was followed by the dismemberment of Africa in the 1885 Berlin Conference, right? And so this is actually something that's personal to me as a Black man, right? This desire to return home to Africa, because I mean, to this day, my own African heritage is still unclear, right? And so this is kind of like a blockage that illustrates the lasting effects of colonialism. So the title of my presentation, right, is Afrofuturism, Pan-African Identity Through Social Connectedness, right? So what is social connectedness? So some say that this kind of longing to return home that I experienced personally and that I'm sure some people can relate to is some say that this longing to return home is remedied by like a trip home to the motherland, right? Or like an ancestry.com result. But I believe that social connectedness among diasporic siblings is the cornerstone of true healing, liberation, and growth among people of the African diaspora. And so social connectedness can shape many aspects of social and economic activity, right? Migration and trade, job seeking, innovation, consumer preferences, and sentiment. It has a huge impact on public health, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more through my lens as a clinical psychologist, and also social mobility. And so the diaspora is characterized, right? The African diaspora is characterized by us as African people being separated from the African continent and spread out, right? But how do we see each other when we cross paths in various settings, right? So when, for example, when an African American encounters a Ghanaian while visiting Ghana, how connected do they feel to one another, right? Or when a Ghanaian encounters a Black man while on campus at Howard, right? So how connected do they feel? So one study that I'm going to review later describes how connected diasporic siblings feel in a university setting specifically. Okay, so let's jump into my research question and the objectives, right? So I think this idea of social connectedness is further contextualized with respect to whether both diasporic siblings have knowledge of the Pan-African movement. So my current research question seeks to understand whether knowledge of Pan-Africanism can foster social connectedness. So my first objective is to kind of measure social connectedness, measure Pan-Africanism, and then objective 2 would be to identify barriers to social connectedness and Pan-Africanism. And also I want to just quantify this relationship between adoption of Pan-African ideals and social connectedness. And lastly, assess feasibility of fostering social connectedness through Pan-African educational modules, right? If they don't know, maybe we could teach them. And so social connectedness has a huge impact on health. So this is one study by Stanford Medicine. Benefits of high social connection include a 50% increased chance of longevity. Your lifespan can be increased 50% just by having a social group that you feel connected to, right? And if we're lacking in social connectedness, this can be worse for your health than smoking, high blood pressure, or obesity all combined, right? So this can have a huge impact through a public health lens. So before I jump into my literature review, I wanted to kind of touch on, I'm gonna go into a couple of the articles, right, that explore this sense of social connectedness among a couple different diasporic siblings and how connected they feel to individuals from African nations, right? And so who do you guys think, if you could type in the chat A or B, who do you guys think expressed more social connectedness to African nationals? Do you think it was Caribbean Americans or do you think it was African Americans? Type A or B in the chat. Okay, all right, so I see a lot of A's. Most people said Caribbean Americans. Okay, I got a couple more B's. Kofi says B, Miranda says B. Okay, interesting. And so the actual result was, let me go to the next slide. So overall, 7 out of 10 Black Americans felt close, right? While only 6 out of 10 African Americans felt close. So findings from this study of African Americans and and Black Caribbeans perceptions of closeness to African nationals support social connection with people in Africa, right? The majority of both Black Caribbeans and African Americans felt close to Black people in Africa. However, Black Caribbeans endorse this view to a greater extent than did African Americans, with 72% of Black Caribbeans and 58% of African Americans reporting that they feel close to Black people in Africa. And so this was actually, they found that this was that Caribbean Americans had an increased closeness due to, there was some variables that stood out that moderated the relationship, like socioeconomic status and immigration status, like whether they were first or second generation here in the US. Another really interesting study that I wanted to point out from the literature review was this one right here. We had a finding of college students, right? 345 college students in this sample of African, Caribbean, and Black American college students showed that students across ethnic backgrounds reported higher feelings of closeness with their same ethnic peers than those of different ethnicities, right? And so I think that, here, let's go to this next slide here. I think that university settings are especially important, right? I want to focus my intervention to take place in educational settings, right? Providing these educational modules to increase sense of social connectedness among diasporic siblings. And so as I finish off here, I just wanted to leave with a quote from Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was aware of the role of educational system in hiding or eradicating non-Western history and kind of blocking Pan-African knowledge. So Malcolm X said that it's no accident that such a high state of culture existed in Africa and that you and I know nothing about it. Why? The man knew that as long as you and I thought we were somebody, he could never treat us like we were nobody, right? So he had to invent a system that would strip us of everything about us that we could use to prove that we were somebody, right? And so I hope that the present study will function to kind of spread awareness and knowledge of the Pan-African movement and foster social connectedness, healing, and pathways to liberation among diasporic siblings. I mean, in a perfect world, I would love to see, you know, Pan-African knowledge taught in public schools here in America. I can only speak to my experiences with the education system here. And it wasn't until, I believe it was Kweku's presentation the other day that highlighted that, you know, a lot of us aren't getting knowledge of our African history until, you know, we get up to the college level. It's really definitely wasn't my experience in the public schools here in America. I didn't learn about it until my first Africana Studies course in undergraduate. So yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Dion. Thank you, all of you. We are going to, before we open to the question, great presentation. I think I have like a question for each of you, but you can still, you can still write the question in the chat. So I will start with Aseye. So Aseye, you were talking, I think, about the Hausa film, and you said that there is a silence about Hausa film in Ghana. And I wanted maybe you to tell us more about it, because Hausa community is a big community. You have them in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in so many countries. So what do you mean by the silence of the Hausa film in Ghana?
So the Hausas are not an ethnic group in Ghana. They're a collection of people from different places. And I use the word collection because in Accra, in a place called Nima, in the middle of the city, where you find most Hausa-speaking people, because there are other neighborhoods to that have, but this is a central point. The people who make up this space are migrants from other parts of West Africa and northern Ghana and also some other parts of Ghana, but the majority are from the rest of West Africa. And even though this place has been in existence since 1874, I think, because of the people who were in the British constabulary and had to find a space to stay, this has become a place of travel, of return, of commerce, of everything. But Hausa is not a formal language in Ghana, but it's a West African language, a lingua franca, and also used for many things now. Because I'm guessing that because of this, even though they exist and we know them and there's constant interaction, and this neighborhood exists with other neighborhoods of Hausa-speaking people, because probably the language has not been formalized, they think there's an unintentional, because I don't think it's intentional, unintentional silence of every time the Ghanaian cinema is categorized, where you hear English-speaking cinema, Akan or Tree-speaking cinema, and the rest, you almost don't hear about Hausa, even though it's thriving. They are part of the industry. They are part of the growing GDP, etc. You know, so that's why I said it's silent, but not because there's supposed to be an erasure. No, it's just, I think it's just a politics of many things. And also because the supposed headquarters of the place is considered one of the biggest slums, but also considered a complex space, because in giving it a slum status, at the same time too, like I said, there's a lot of commercial activity there. It's multi-ethnic, multi-national, and many things. So and I find that interesting, that for the existence of this place and what is done from that place, there's a supposed silence. That's why I use the word silence. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. So just a quick one to what you just said. So except for the language, what is the particularity of the Hausa cinema?
Except for the language, so there are many things that come up in Hausa films. You know, there are issues about polygamy, inheritance, home, place, also, what do you call it? Commerce. But you find out that in Hausa cinema, also Islam is very, very prominent. But it's also because there's also the assumption that most people in that space are Muslims. But what is most intriguing is that you find that in the dialogue in some of these films, the way people reference home. So one moment, the film is set in Nima, somewhere in Accra, but this person tells you that, oh, they are going to home, even though in that same film, the person is claiming that particular space as home. And in that home, you find that the person is probably going to Niger or Nigeria or something. Or you also find out that somebody's wearing something, and then the character says, oh, what you're wearing is really beautiful. And he said, oh, but you know that my mother is Yoruba, so I get things from. So it's just the fluid nature with which as people come and go, and conversations happen, but you do not really think about it when you're thinking of transnationalism or Pan-Africanism or diaspora, etc. Because some of these filmmakers really are not into all these theories, but yet the way they're incorporated into these films without them even knowing that we are having these conversations are things I find very interesting beyond the language. And also, whatever we do, the language is important because you see, it is, you find it here, you find Nigerian Hausa cinema thriving in Nigeria, you find Hausa cinema also thriving in Niger. And the way in which they connect also matters, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Jessica, I find it interesting the way you're comparing the energy and security between the US and Ghana. I know maybe it's still part of the research, but if you have do you have some result about that? What's the objective of the study? And also, what can Ghana do different or better than US at this point?
Well, as far as with the study and my research, it's really more so looking, of course, you know, just worldwide and the big issue of, or the complexity, I guess, as it relates to looking at cybersecurity, focusing in on energy poverty, energy insecurity. And so specifically, as we think about Ghana in particular, very similar to some of the situations as far as within the US, and just with the populations and with the ability, kind of I guess the infrastructure and, you know, and I guess that understanding that, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that you may have, you know, you may see transmission tower, you know, the power lines and that sort of thing. But as far as getting it to every single citizen, that's a different story. And it is, you know, there is a whole, within the US, there's an economic and a racial component. And within Ghana, you know, even though you may not have the racial component, but as far as the economic component. And so because what many often don't realize is, as you're seeing with the building of electrical lines, like where you see them maybe underground versus overground, that's because the people who are moving into that particular area or the business is paying for those lines to be underground. So there's an economic component with getting electricity. And so, that's something that we see as far as if you looked at the percentages within Ghana and the percentages, within the US, specifically in Ghana, looking at that difference as far as the percentage that currently does not receive electricity. It may be because, again, looking at economics and the ability for that community to be able to finance the connection to the community, to the actual power lines and the power plants and that sort of thing. And then your second question, remind me of your second question again. I apologize.
Do you find some new solution coming from Ghana or Africa, also with the Ukraine war, we can have like different things and different outcome today?
Well, one of the things that's crucial is the whole, what we call the renewable space. And renewable just simply means anything that's coming from a natural source. So you have as I mentioned, the solar panels, which is coming from the sun. You have the battery energy storage, which even though that's not coming from a source, it still is allowing you, if you have a solar panel, you can, when the sun is not shining, you can store that electricity within that battery so that at night you will still have electricity that was supplied during the day from those solar panels. And then also with wind farms, of course, it's coming from the wind. So when you look at the continent, in Ghana and all of the other countries, there is I think a good opportunity there when you think of things like the technology behind solar panels and the fact that globally the price of solar panels is coming. That's probably one of the driving forces besides just climate of them being more widespread. You literally can have a total rural community out in the middle of nowhere that can have a solar panel that may be not very expensive, hopefully get some type of battery energy storage, and they can have what we refer to as a microgrid, meaning that they're self-contained, conducting their own electricity and using their own electricity, for that, serving that particular village, that particular city, and so there's lots of opportunities there as the price of these renewable type sources, as the prices come down, and it allows for these isolated, self-contained ability to supply electricity.
Okay, thank you. So there is a question in the chat for Ebenezer. So kindly shed light critically on why the choice of that space of area of Greater Accra for your research.
Would you want me to go now?
Yes, please. If you can answer the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, so I particularly chose or selected that area because of primarily their history of contact with colonialism, right? The fact that there are still relics of for instance, you have the fort over there, you have some other relics of colonialism still present over there. My interest was to find out whether they were impacted by these imported practices. That's number one. The other thing too is that I find that there are parallel practices of both Western ideologies. And so, for instance, when it comes to education, you still find that within that area, there's still the traditional formal education ongoing. And then at the same time, you also find that we are incorporating the Western idea of schooling over there. And this whole idea of a festival that's drawing people from all over the world, there's this constant interaction with the Western world. I'm interested in finding out what that is, whether that is impacting the way they think about children or they construct our, also because that area is also located within the central business districts of the region. Perhaps maybe because of the business of that area, might that have an effect on the way children are constructed? Children as a whole are constructed, and when they become offenders, those are my justifications for selecting that particular area.
Okay, thank you. But I also have a question for you. During your presentation, you were talking about youth criminality under colonization, and I just wanted to know how big was that issue? Because in my understanding, people were going at a young age, they were going to work in mines or plantation or whatever. So, but that issue of youth criminality, I don't know if you find out something on it. How big was it under the colonization?
It was happening, but as to whether it was that big, it wasn't that big because these things were mostly happening at city centers. So, for instance, you find places like Takrady. Takrady is in the western region of Ghana, where we have a port over there. So it's a channel through which we have people coming into the country through that channel. So you find these young boys, or these, youth finding themselves around that place also because there are foreigners over there. So you find them within those areas, you find them within Accra, you find them around Cape Coast, those city centers, those peak areas. So it may not have been that much pronounced, but it was happening. I'm yet to come across statistics, but there are court records of youth being brought there to be tried for such issues.
No, okay. Thank you about that. So I have a question for Eric. What was the consequence of the protests and the resistance that you were talking in the Ghanaian society during the period that you choose? Is he here?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I heard the question very well. It's part of what I'm still digging, but some answers that I could offer is one thing. It led to frequent adjustments of labor policy, right? Because they were spending money, bringing people in, and people were not arriving at destination. When they arrived at destination, they couldn't stay behind to do the work. So there was a constant shortage of labor in the mines. And with this constant shortage of labor, the mine managers by then had formed an association which grew into a lobbyist group of a sort. So they were in a position to put pressure on the colonial government, which would also act based on that pressure to draw a lot more labor and so on and so forth. So eventually, the system of forced labor recruitment for the mines was entirely abolished. Is it connected in any way to the constant desertions and forms of protest that the sector encountered? Quite possibly, but I don't also discount other factors in creating that. Thank you very much for the question.
Okay, but is it also earlier to think that it can be linked to the independent movement? Because in 1930, where African independent movements really started, like.
Well, so if you see the independent movement as an event, which took place in 1957, then the answer to that question would be no. But if you see it as a set of processes which culminated in the famous 1957 movement, then definitely, because here were people who were being colonized. Their personal sovereignty had been taken from them by drawing them from their homes and forcing them to do jobs that they didn't want to do. And what did they do in response to that? They said, no, we won't do it. And they took off, or they refused to honor whatever bonds that they did. So the collective activities of ordinary people and workers of this nature eventually had a hand in bringing about what became independence in 1957. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't know if we still have questions from the attendees, but I still have a last question though, who will go to Dion and your social connectedness concept. And I want to ask you, during your research, did you find something about how African people are also connected to the diaspora, and do they have a place where they are most connected to the diaspora or not?
I was mostly looking at like between groups instead of like within groups. But that would definitely be like an interesting area. Another trend that I noticed is that in terms of like diasporic siblings, most of the well, at least the studies that I could find were just studying like how for example, the one about Caribbean Americans and African Americans, how connected they felt to African nationals, but there weren't studies in the reverse, like how connected African nationals felt to other members of the diaspora, which I think, you know, would definitely be interesting to probe and find out more about. But no, I didn't see any data like that out there yet, but the search continues.
Okay, but is there a result about how the image of the continent impact the social connectedness?
How the image of the continent,
Yes,
like from
like
outside groups or from in groups?
for like the group, like the fact that you know what the bad image of the continent now, except for music, but generally we have all that bad image and a lot of stereotypes. So does that affect the people's social connectedness or not?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think about it. I don't necessarily have an answer for it. I can give kind of like my opinion. I think that definitely that would play a significant role. Because you know, perceptions of the continent, especially how it's portrayed through media and all these other outlets you described, like I think that definitely does have a big impact on how connected you feel to the continent, right? And probably more so for, I know for me, like as a African American, as a Black man, like I'm not as close to, you know, a lot of those realities that occur for African nationals. So I'm not sure, like I think it's a good question. I think it would have a significant role, but I didn't see anything about that specifically.
Okay, I think Miranda has a question for Eric. So, okay, thank you, Linda, for asking a similar question. I had for Nat Kamado, very interesting to hear about the effectiveness of the workers' resistance method and potential connection to the broader independence movement. Could he also speak to any similarities he may see that this historic case of resistance may have with labor struggle today in Ghana? So Eric, the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Miranda, for the question. I would say that this was the beginning of creating something like a working class, right? In the modern sense, how it's considered. Now, the reactions to the policy and to the oppression that they encountered have been considered by one scholar, Jeff Crisp, I'm sure, as the seeds, right? Or the very beginnings of labor unionism, labor struggles, and, you know, all matters of labor engagement with employers. I mean, Jeff Crisp considers the activities of these people who were forced to labor by the British government as the very beginning of labor unions in Ghana. So in that sense, we could speak of a connection between labor struggles at the time and now. Just that, you know, today labor struggles are, I don't know, should I call it bureaucratized or quite well organized? These were usually unorganized, or even where there was organization, they were very very little forms of organization. So, and of course, there is the constant involvement of the employer in the activities of labor unions. There are negotiation structures or institutions that are there to address concerns and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in a way, there are similarities just as there are differences. Thank you very much. But I have a question for Dion. Dion, in your conceptualization of social connectedness, have you thought about, or is there room for the 3 cycles of life, which are the ancestors, the living, and the yet to be born? And this question comes from another scholar. I don't know if you already know about, but if you don't, I'm happy to introduce him to you. His name is Ayikwe Ama, who is quite a thinker on the subject of connection and the importance of connection in Africa, how connection among these 3 cycles, right, forms the core philosophy of African societies. I hope the question is clear.
No, that's a really good question. And honestly, this is why I was so interested in coming to the symposium, is so that I can get these different perspectives. If you could just repeat, I haven't heard of that scholar. If you could drop his name in the chat, that would be super helpful for me. And then if you could just repeat those 3 cycles, those ancestors, what was the other 2?
The living and the yet to be born.
Living and yet to be born. No, I definitely haven't. I think that the whole notion of, I was just talking to one of my mentors about the project, and she was bringing up how, you know, ancestors are like a fundamental part of just like thinking in general in, you know, African countries, and like how here in America we kind of refuse to recognize that. And honestly, especially in clinical psychology, like talk about ancestors and stuff like that is it's pathologized almost. And it's a huge fundamental part of understanding, like, you know, people who are among the African diaspora, even African Americans here. Like a lot of our spiritual practices are kind of rooted in ancestor work. And I think that is a big missing piece. The closest thing that I could say that I saw in my data in terms of putting it into that type of framework would be that social connectedness was influenced by age. The older subjects reported increased social connectedness. Also, gender was a factor. Males reported more social connectedness in the diaspora, more so than females, which I thought was interesting. But I think a similar framework that I can kind of parallel to the one that you offered about the ancestors, the living, and the yet to be living would be kind of like a developmental framework in clinical psychology. But that would just be across the lifespan. That's one problem with a lot of these kind of like westernized, you know, psychological frameworks, is that they don't account for that spirituality piece. And I think that spirituality piece is key in understanding the African diaspora. No, so I guess the answer is no, but yes, I definitely value that question. I value that framework, and I'm excited to look into that scholar that you shared. I'm gonna check the chat to see if you dropped it yet. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I will also add that maybe you can also look at Dion, like how the sick, let's say, you know, the age can, the influence of the age on social connectedness, because I saw that in the diaspora, when the children start going back home, when they are kids, their social connectedness might be higher than those who discover home when they are just adult. So let's see, do we have a last question or comment? Yeah. Oh. So if we don't, so I'll just once again say thank you, congratulate all of you for the presentation. That was great presentation, and thanks for our Department of African Studies here at Howard and the University of Legon in Ghana for creating this connection, having this dialogue between us. as an African studies student, it's important for me first also to keep having that connection with also my colleague and peer brothers and sisters on the continent. So thank you again, and I will hang on to Dr. Clark for the final word.
Thank you. Again, I actually am looking forward to ASAA. I'm hoping that to see some of you in the DRC in October. So I'm looking forward to the call for papers. I don't think the call for papers has gone out yet, but again, it's important that we have this conversation, but I also, you know, in terms of attending conferences and, you know, presenting together and kind of taking these conversations further, I definitely encourage, because everyone did such a great job. I would love to see many of you present your research at some of the conferences. But great job, presenters, great job, moderators, both yesterday and today. Dr. Freywatt, did you have any last words?
No, I don't have any last words. Just thank you so much to everyone. Congrats. The field of African studies is in some good hands in the next, 5 years. I'm looking forward to everybody's, published work, looking forward to going to defenses and vivas, because I know that once we, in a couple of years, in a few years, perhaps, as we step to the next stage of our career, you all will be stepping into your careers. So I'm just excited to see that. Congratulations, everyone. Aiko.
All right, bye.